Oscar Piastri wins the Belgian Grand Prix in convincing fashion. A much needed win for him to get some of the momentum back in his favor for the championship fight, but it came thanks to another what-if Sunday for his teammate Lando Norris. It was a promising day for Ferrari and their new rear suspension after a pretty disappointing Saturday, and it was a mixed bag of results for a handful of teams. Red Bull, Mercedes, Williams, Racing Bulls, Alpine, all had a driver doing pretty well, all had a driver not doing so well. We're about to dive into everything we saw this weekend at the Belgian Grand Prix, all coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. Oscar Piastri is back on the top step of the podium. His 8th win of his career, 6th of the season, but his first time winning in Spa. Lando Norris finishes P2, Charles Leclerc P3 to round off the podium. We'll get to Lando in a second, but it feels right to start with Oscar after this dominant weekend by him. We see it in the sport from time to time. Sometimes we come into a race weekend, and it's clear a driver is completely on their A game. And other than a few moments in the middle of this weekend, that was Oscar this weekend. He clearly looked like the fastest driver on track for almost the entirety of the weekend, and it was the type of weekend he needed after back-to-back wins by his teammate. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. For a moment, it looked like it might be slipping away from Oscar on Saturday. Of course, he put together that incredible qualifying lap in SQ3, setting a track record. But as we know in Spa, pole doesn't mean much because of that long run up Eau Rouge down into turn 5. And that was enough for Max to get a great run around Oscar to take the lead. But even after that pass, I think all of us who aren't die-hard Max Verstappen fans were expecting Oscar to get back around Max at some point during that sprint race. And it just never happened. But it wasn't just Oscar's inability to get around Max, it was Lando closing the gap to Oscar too. And some of this was thanks to the track and how difficult it is to pass in most parts of this track. And we saw that with Lando too once he caught up to Oscar, but just wasn't able to get around him himself. And I think Oscar was faster than Max, but just wasn't fast enough to get around him, and that probably brought Lando back into play. But after that sprint result, and after Lando got pole for the Grand Prix, you were thinking maybe this is slipping away from Oscar. But as Oscar learned on Saturday, thanks to Max, pole doesn't mean much at Spa. And he showed us that's even the case with a rolling start in the rain. Now it's time to talk about Lando, because this is where the mistakes really started to come into play. Let's give Oscar his credit. That was an incredible start by him to begin the Grand Prix, especially on a wet track with all of the spray in the car in front. But this was also just a terrible start by Lando. There's a little confusion over the cause of this whole battery issue that he had at the start. Based on the radio messages we heard on the broadcast, it sounded like Lando just used way too much battery behind the safety car to start the race. After the race, though, the team made it seem more like it was just some mechanical issue that they need to look into. Maybe a little PR move by them to do that. But outside of the battery issue, it looked like Lando also just went way too early. It was just a weird part of the track to hit the gas and accelerate, and he did not catch Oscar off guard at all. But on top of the battery issue, on top of going too early, Lando got way too loose coming out of turn 1. And at that point, you knew Oscar passing him was just inevitable. And once Oscar made that pass, it put the race right back into his hands. But you can still look back at this race and say it wasn't entirely over for Lando in that moment. But the mistakes just kept on coming. And to Lando's credit, some of those mistakes fall on the McLaren pit wall too. We all knew being the second car was going to be a huge disadvantage with a drying track because you're almost certainly the second car to pit, and you're just going to lose so much time staying out for that extra lap. So, do you risk losing that time staying out, or do you risk losing time trying a double stack? McLaren obviously went for the first option with Lando, and I think we can say it was probably the wrong call looking back at it. At this point, he already had a 10-second lead on Leclerc in third, so there was enough room for him to drop back a few seconds, give the team enough time to make the double stack work. If they went for this option, I'm guessing Lando probably comes out 5 or 6 seconds behind Oscar, but instead he stays out that extra lap, and the gap is around 9 seconds after the pit stops. Now, there is the question whether McLaren would have put Lando on the hard tires if they tried the double stack. Personally, I don't think they would have. I think it would have been a medium tire call. And that means Lando would have been on the same tire as Oscar with the same tire life, so there wouldn't be that tire advantage for Lando. I think we can be honest with this one. Although it was a mistake, it's probably still a stretch to say it was the one that cost Lando the win today. Because one of the biggest takeaways from this Grand Prix was Oscar's ability to manage his tires during that second stint on the mediums. We've seen a lot of improvements from Oscar in this area this year, but tire saving has always been his biggest weakness. And those demons have still come out at points this year. And there was a moment halfway through the race where you heard Oscar's radio message and you start thinking, are we about to see this again from him? Especially with Lando possibly pushing him on a longer lasting hard tire. So again, we can admit it was the wrong call. Hopefully McLaren learns from it. But this wasn't a fatal mistake for Lando. Because coming out of the pit stops with Oscar on the medium tire and Lando on the hards, there was still a chance for Lando. Oscar finished this race with a 3.4 second gap to Lando, and in reality it was more like a 4-second gap, accounting for Oscar lifting as he crossed the finish line. But this was a gap that could have been made up if Lando drove a clean race. I think I counted 3 seconds that were lost by Lando, either locking up his tires or going off track. Not to mention another couple of seconds that were lost with the slow pit stop. But if those things don't happen, Lando is very likely on Oscar's gearbox with DRS to end this race. But again, like we've said on too many Sundays with Lando, we're back playing the would've, could've, should've game, looking at another win that slipped away. To me, this race was pretty symbolic for the championship race we've seen so far. Oscar comes out of this weekend 16 points ahead of Lando in the driver's standings, so this thing is far from over. We still have 11 races left. All it takes is one crash from Oscar, a mechanical issue that takes him out of the race. That gap's gone. But with how close these drivers are, this championship is probably going to be decided by the finest of margins. And that's what we've seen through 13 races so far. Oscar's been the most consistent of the two. Yeah, he's had a few mistakes. He hasn't been perfect. But Lando has had a lot more. And I think Nico Rosberg said it perfectly before the race. When Oscar makes a mistake, he loses maybe 1 position. When Lando makes a mistake, he loses probably 6. And that's why we're sitting here at this point of the season looking at Oscar in first place and Lando in second. Going to Ferrari, it didn't start off that great, but I think it was overall a positive weekend for them in their new rear suspension. Charles Leclerc finishes P3 in the Grand Prix and P4 in the sprint race. Saturday was a much worse day for Lewis with a P15 in the sprint, but P7 on Sunday. I think there was a little disappointment for Ferrari that the new suspension didn't work as well as they thought it would, but they still look stronger than Red Bull and Mercedes, and I think that was the most they realistically could have gotten out of this upgrade. I was impressed with the wheel-to-wheel racing by Charles Leclerc in the Grand Prix with Max. And I guess I shouldn't be that surprised. He's proven to be one of the best wheel-to-wheel racers in the sport. But when things were wet, Max looked faster than Leclerc, and he was right up on his gearbox ready to pass him. And I think a lot of this came down to the setup changes between the two cars. But there was some really good defending by Charles to hold on to that third place position. Going to Lewis, again, it was an up and down weekend for him. Really bad qualifying performances for the sprint race and Grand Prix, both being knocked out in SQ1 and Q1. That really wasn't much to do about it on Saturday in a sprint race without any pit stops. But Sunday was a much different story for him. Starting P18 from the pit lane and finishing P7, Lewis was storming through the field at the beginning of this race, which should have been somewhat expected since he qualified so far out of position, but it's not always a guarantee, especially in a wet weather race. Now, a lot of this came from the strategy call to bring Lewis in on lap 11 before really anyone else. When Lewis came into the pits, he was P13. When the rest of the pit stop cycled through two laps later, Lewis was P7. So a huge jump for him. Huge credit to the Ferrari pit wall for bringing him that early. Sunday was a change of pace for Ferrari, though. Yeah, there's still a gap to the McLarens. They're probably not going to close that gap. For the first time in a while, both cars looked a lot more competitive than we're used to. It was a bit of the opposite for Red Bull. A really great Saturday for Max, not as much to write home about for Sunday. Let's talk about the sprint race first because that was just an incredible drive by him. We touched on it earlier. This isn't always a track where you're thrilled to get pole, because whoever that second car is usually gets a really good chance at an overtake going into turn 5. And that's exactly what happened with Max and Oscar on Saturday. That overtake by Max was somewhat expected, but Max holding on to the lead was certainly not. Oscar was really putting that pressure on Max the entire sprint race, and you kept thinking, all right, when's this move going to happen? But Max defended every single time. He was given a little bit of an advantage over the McLaren thanks to Red Bull's setup choice, which gave him just more straight line speed, and that was definitely a weakness for the McLaren setup. But it was still another race where you come out of it just shaking your head at how Max can continue to pull out these unexpected wins. Sunday was a little different, though. After Max qualified P4, it became pretty clear to all of us that a win probably wasn't in the cards for Sunday, and he was open about that too, saying his fight was with Charles before the race. It was clear watching that race too that Red Bull opted for a wet weather setup, thinking it was going to rain most of the race, and it probably would have if we didn't have that massive delay to start. But once it dried out, he was clearly at a disadvantage to Charles, who had a much better setup for the dry weather. Max did close the gap to Charles a little bit at the end, so a podium might have felt like it was in reach, but if I were him, I'd still be happy with this result, especially if I was Red Bull too. Going to his teammate, another mediocre weekend for Yuki Tsunoda, P11 in the sprint race, P13 in the Grand Prix. I don't think you can fault him for Sunday, though. This one looked like it came down to a mistimed strategy call by the team. Right before the pit stops, Yuki's up in P7, ahead of both of the Racing Bulls, not far off from Max. Really right where you would hope him to be if you're Red Bull. But then the first group comes into the pits on lap 11, and then the majority of the field comes in on lap 12. But Red Bull keeps him out until lap 13. And leaving him out for that extra lap or two, honestly just ruined his race. He comes out of the pits in P12, and it was just an uphill battle from there, being stuck behind Pierre Gasly for most of the race. It is still fair to ask, though, why a Red Bull with DRS can't get around an Alpine. But maybe that's where this Red Bull car is, when Max isn't behind the wheel. For Yuki, I just don't see this getting any better anytime soon. I don't think it'll be long before we either hear an announcement from him that he's going to a new team next year, or an announcement from Red Bull that they'll be moving in a different direction for their second driver. For Mercedes, some good, some bad. Saturday was just really all bad. P12 for George Russell and P17 for Kimi Antonelli in the sprint. These sprint results really started in qualifying, but this car just completely lacked any pace this weekend. And once qualifying was set, there really just wasn't much that there was going to change with a dry track in Spa for a 15-lap sprint race. George bounced back in the Grand Prix on Sunday, though, really just setting himself up with a better qualifying result that put him in P6 to start the race. There was a moment that I thought he might be in the fight with Max and Charles, but I think George still has this problem of just pushing way too hard at the beginning of a stint and paying the price later for it. But even if he got the most out of the car, I don't know if it really changes this P5 result for him. It was a much different Sunday for Kimi Antonelli and really capped off a weekend to forget for him. Out in SQ1, out in Q1. He had that rough interview on Saturday where you could see the emotions had been getting the best of him. Teary-eyed, just not what you like to see. He's just really been in a bad place lately. He's only scored points in 1 out of the last 7 races, and you have to wonder if these are just rookie growing pains or if the uncertainty about his future is starting to catch up. And it looks like we should be getting new contracts for George and Kimi soon, so if that's the case, it should take care of itself. But it can't be easy being an 18-year-old at a top team, replacing one of the greatest drivers ever, and answering questions about whether you'll be on the team next year. We've got one more race to go before the summer break, but that month off might be exactly what Kimi needs to reset. Alright, let's talk some midfield teams. Like Red Bull and Mercedes, for a lot of these teams, it was a good day for one driver, a not so good day for the other. We'll start with Williams. It was this day Saturday and Sunday for the team, with just the drivers swapping their good and bad days. Carlos Sainz finished P6 in the sprint, while Alex Albon had to settle for P16. This one really came down to qualifying, with both finishing where they qualified. The sprint race was tough. Sometimes we get excitement, but more often than not, it can be a little uneventful. And I do like the sprint races. I'd much rather see them than another practice session that doesn't really mean much. But it's clear the FIA needs to be very particular on where they put these sprint races. And Spa might not be one of them. Going to Sunday, though, the roles reversed for the Grand Prix. Alex Albon finishes P6 and Carlos Sainz only finishes P18. Really weird to see such different results for both drivers. Obviously, Albon qualifying P5 and Sainz starting from the pit lane played a big role in these results. But Sainz was struggling so much with his tires, and that really took him out of contention to make anything out of this race. It's honestly just really weird to me how much Albon's outperforming him at this point. After this race, Albon is 8th in the standings with 54 points. Sainz is 16th with 16 points. Even with the experience Albon has at this team, I don't think anyone expected Carlos to struggle this much. But even with the bad Sunday for Carlos, it was still a good Sunday for the team. At this stage of the season, anytime they can get points, it's a good day. And the 8 points from a P6 finish is exactly what this team needed, with some of these midfield teams catching up to them. It was a pretty good Saturday for Racing Bulls. P8 for Isaac Hadjar and P10 for Liam Lawson in the sprint race. Again, another product of qualifying, with an uneventful sprint race that only saw 4 overtakes in 15 laps. Liam kept it going on Sunday with a P8, but man, what a rough Grand Prix for Isaac Hadjar. Like Yuki, he can thank his pit wall for this one. They also left him out until lap 13. Before the pit stop started, Isaac was sitting in P8. After the pit stops, he comes out in P15. It was also really weird to me that the team decided to pit Liam first, who was behind Isaac at the time. I'd have to go back to the radio calls and see if this was a decision made by the driver instead of the pit wall. If it was, a little weird that you would let a rookie make that decision, but just still very out of the ordinary. But after the pit stop, Isaac just could not get his tires going. Comes in for a second stop on lap 20 for hard tires. I think Racing Bulls in this moment thought, okay, everyone but maybe Lando was going to do a 2-stop, so they're just trying to get an advantage out of it and, get ahead of some cars, but obviously it backfired on them. A tough weekend for Racing Bulls, though, to only come away with 5 points out of the weekend when they really should have had more. Terrible Saturday for Alpine. P19 for Franco Colapinto, DNF for Pierre Gasly after he didn't even start the race on time. Sunday was the same for Franco with another P19, but Pierre at least got a point with a P10 finish. It's only a point, but it's still something for the last place team, and probably the most they could have gotten out of the weekend. I don't want to say he was necessarily quick, but Pierre had a DRS train behind him and defended pretty well against it the entire race. I don't know what to say about his teammate Franco Colapinto at this point. Another result at the bottom of the order, and you have to expect his time is probably coming to an end. He'll be there in Hungary. It's a week away. They're not going to make a change right now. But after that, I think that's the last we see of him in this car. I don't know who the replacement will be, but this is worse than Jack Doohan was. And we know how impatient Flavio Briatore can be with an underperforming driver. Pretty good weekend for Gabriele Bortoleto, P9 in the sprint race and Grand Prix, his second points finish of his career. Unfortunately, 0 points this weekend from Nico Hülkenberg with a P18 in the sprint and P12 in the Grand Prix. It was a weird strategy call from the Sauber pit wall that I think might have cost Nico a points finish today. They bring him in for a second stop on lap 32. When they brought him in, he was sitting in P10 with Gasly 6 seconds behind in 11th place. I guess the team felt it was too risky to continue on those tires until the end, but there was no immediate threat from Gasly behind. And it looks like they would have been fine leaving Nico out until the end, especially since Bortoleto made it until the end. So a tough break for them, but at least it was only 1 point lost and not more. A really good Saturday for Haas, but not so great of a Sunday for them. P5 for Esteban Ocon, P7 for Ollie Bierman in the sprint race, but a P11 for Ollie and P15 for Ocon in the Grand Prix. Another one that really came down to their qualifying positions for both races. Now, Ocon fell victim to the late pit stop strategy too. He also came in on lap 13. Before the pit stops, he was sitting in P11. After that, dead last. So, some credit to Ocon for getting up to 15th, but today just was not their day. It was a pretty bad weekend for Aston Martin. Lance Stroll finished P13 and Fernando Alonso finished P14 in the sprint. In the Grand Prix, they finished P14 and P17 respectively. Now, Fernando was hurt a little bit in the Grand Prix by pit strategy. I'm guessing he needed to, but he stopped a second time on lap 29 for a new set of mediums, and that obviously pushed him further down the order with almost everyone else going for a one-stop. But at the same time, both cars weren't really that close to making it into the points anyway. This weekend was a little bit of a shocking result for Aston, considering how much better this car's looked the last few races. But at the same time, that's how tight the midfield is this year. You get the setup wrong, or the track doesn't suit your car that great, and you can just tumble down the order. All right, that'll do it on today's episode recapping the Belgian Grand Prix weekend. We will, of course, be back next weekend, off to Budapest for the Hungarian Grand Prix, the anniversary, well, not timely anniversary, but the race Oscar Piastri got his first win last year, and we're back to a normal schedule without a sprint race weekend. I will, of course, be back probably on Friday with a preview episode for that Grand Prix weekend, and then back on Sunday with a recap episode of everything we saw on track that weekend. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Till next time.